So please welcome Professor Scott.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for this extremely kind invitation. And if anybody here has seen my TED Talk, it's going to seem horribly familiar. Okay, you're allowed to doze lightly throughout. So I'm going to talk about the science of laughter. And I just want to start a little bit by thinking that there even could be such a thing. If you go onto one of the databases of published papers in science, and you do a search on a term like fear, emotion, expression, and fear, you'll get back over 4,000 published papers. We study fear a lot. And you just replace the term fear with laughter, you'll get back about 150 papers. There are very, very few studies of laughter. And it's interesting if you go back a little bit further, because you can date a lot of our current research into human emotions and animal emotions back to the work of Charles Darwin, who wrote a lot about this. He wrote alongside his work on evolution, he was very interested in how some emotional states might be shared across humans and other animals, and that might tell you something about how they'd evolved. And he wrote about emotions like fear and anger and sadness and disgust, and he also wrote a lot about laughter. And over the next sort of 150 years, we've picked up on a great deal of his work. There's a huge amount of research, as I say, into fear and disgust and anger, everything really but laughter. So what I'm going to try and do today is pick up on, fill in some of the gaps, because Darwin thought that laughter really mattered, and I think he was probably right. So someone who's done a huge amount of work, really building on Charles Darwin's work, is the American psychologist Paul Ekman. And Charles Darwin was hypothesizing about certain human emotions being kind of shared across all humans and found in other animals. And Paul Ekman actually did the hard work establishing that this was the case. So what Paul Ekman determined was that there are 6 emotions, which he called basic emotions. And there are some of the emotions that Charles Darwin talked about. So we've got happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise. And what Paul Ekman found was no matter where you go in the world, if you show these to people, they know what these emotions mean. So he was really putting the time in. He was kind of tramping across Papua New Guinea to encounter people who'd never met a white European man. And he was finding that they would recognize these emotional states, even though they hadn't encountered European faces before. There's some greater meaning to this. It's part of our evolutionary history. And I was working on this back in the 1990s with colleagues at Cambridge. And they were looking at faces, and I worked on voices, so I was coming up with vocal versions of these. And I think it's very interesting. But one of the things that was really striking, these really are these basic emotions. They're sort of what evolution has given us is like a sort of a starting set for emotions. It's by no means all your emotional experience, but they're all negative. There's only happiness that's definitely a positive emotion here. And I had the opportunity to meet Paul Ekman at a conference a few years later, and I expressly asked him this, if these really are the basic emotions, why are they all so negative apart from happiness? And he turned out to have thought about this quite a lot. And he thought that there were more positive emotions out there that could be these basic emotions, but which they wouldn't necessarily be conveyed well by static photographs of faces. And he thought they'd be really well conveyed by body movements and by the voice, and that's the kind of thing I do, so I started looking more at this. So he was very interested, and he stayed very interested in the emotion of sort of achievement, triumph. This is a UK athlete, Kelly Holmes, who's not just winning a gold medal, she's just realised she's broken a record. So that kind of yes feeling. In the UK, if I'm giving a public lecture, I say, imagine your football team's just scored a goal. That feeling. I'm talking to scientists, I say, imagine you've had a paper accepted. Whatever would work for scientists. Whoa, that feeling. And he also thought that amusement, what he called amusement, that would be another candidate, basic emotion, and also the emotions of relief, contentment, and pleasure. So the more positive emotions out there. To cut a long story short, I've spent the next few years looking at this in a lot more detail, and what we found is that there's good evidence for laughter, amusement, really being a basic emotion. You find it in all human cultures, you find it in other animals. Charles Darwin was right. It likely is part of our evolutionary history. You can leave now. That's the end if you want. Though I will finish. But what is laughter? Laughter is, at its heart, more like a different way of breathing than it is a different way of speaking. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. And it's more like an animal call than it is like speech. Now, obviously, we're animals, but I mean, there are some qualitative differences between how humans talk and how we make emotional sounds like laughter, and I'll show you what I mean by this. So this is human speech. This is running our MRI machine as a video camera to capture the movements we can't normally see inside our mouths when we're talking. And what you see here is something no other animal in nature can do. So what you've got here are incredible deformations of the tongue, the lips, the jaw. There's the voice box making the sound. There's the soft palate when you make an or an sound. That's happening back there. But particularly the tongue. Look at that. That's absolutely extraordinary. Literally no other animal can do this. And what you're doing is you're shaping the characteristics of your mouth so that the noise you make here sounds different because of how you're holding your mouth. And we do this really, really quickly. Now, as soon as we start laughing, this changes altogether. So there's the same person now laughing in the scanner. All of that goes away. Okay, so particularly, you see how the tongue's just sitting at the bottom of the mouth? And there's a big... You can see there's some shaking going on. I'm going to come back to exactly what's happening there. But this is more like an animal call. Other animals make sounds where primarily what's happening is down here at the larynx, and then the mouth opens and closes, and you're not doing all that complex shaping. So that wobbling you're seeing, you can see that she's sort of shaking up and down a lot. That comes back to that point about laughter being more like a different way of breathing. Now, what we have to do to think about breathing is think about a part of the body that in neuroscience we don't pay enough attention to. You have to think about the rib cage. Now, generally, certainly in cognitive neuroscience, we kind of constrain our interest to stuff above the neck, really. We're interested in brains, but in faces, ears, eyes, that kind of thing. If you're very Freudian, you might also be interested in the sort of general pant area, but we don't pay enough attention to the rest of the body, and actually it's amazing. So what you're all doing right now is you are using your rib cages to stay alive. Very important, don't stop. And the way that you're doing this is that you're using the intercostal muscles. These are the muscles between the ribs and the diaphragm across the bottom. You're using those to pull air in and out of the rib cage. That's called metabolic breathing. Very important. If I was to put a breath belt on you, so I'm just measuring the contractions of the overall rib cage, you get this sinusoidal pattern of the air being pulled in, squashed back out again. Very, very important. We share this with all other chordates. As soon as we start talking, you see a different pattern. When humans speak, we take a breath in, and then we use those same intercostal muscles completely differently. And what we're doing is we're actually using the intercostal muscles to provide a very finely controlled flow of air at the voice box here. And if I keep speaking without taking another breath, you'll hear my intercostal muscles start to have to work really, really hard to squeeze the air out, and in the end I'll run out altogether. One of these days I'm going to pass out stone cold at the end of that, but I think we're good. Now you're probably thinking, Sophie, that was interesting and super weird. But it's absolutely critical. We can only talk at all, or sing, or beatbox, or do anything we do with human voices because we can breathe in this way. You get a completely different pattern of breathing, and that's only possible because we walk upright. We freed up our rib cages, they don't have to support our weight. All other quadrupeds, even other apes, have to use their forelimbs to support their weight, and they cannot free up the rib cage in this way. In our evolution, walking upright has freed up our hands, and that's made all sorts of things possible for us to do, and of course our brains as well. We've also, much less visibly, freed up our rib cage, and just like our hands, we have incredible detailed control over the muscles between the ribs. In fact, we have as much fine control over the muscles between our ribs as we do over our fingers. That's how precise these movements are. And as soon as we start laughing, all of this goes away. So this is what laughter looks like. And in fact, this is me talking with the breath belt on. And you can see there, I take a big breath in. Then you get these contractions starting, and that's me starting to laugh at myself. And then you get me carrying on laughing. So now, instead of these smooth movements, or this very fine movement, you get these very large, very fast deflections of the rib cage, and that's just air being squeezed out of you, and that's all laughter is. Very big single contractions of the intercostal muscles squeezing air out. It's an incredibly primitive way of making a sound. We don't understand how it works in the brain, but if there is a competition between breathing and talking and laughing, laughter will win. It stops you breathing, it stops you talking, it's just squeezing air out of you, it's trying to kill you, and it is a relatively dangerous thing to do if you're compromised cardiovascularly. It's not unusual for people to die laughing. Obviously, you're fine, but, just as a heads up. Now, what this means is, quite often when people are laughing and talking, you can actually hear different neural systems fighting each other. And I've got an example of this here. I've got somebody talking on the radio from the Today programme back in the UK, so it's a very serious news programme. And you're going to see the picture of the
Iraq's unpopular replacement has now been dismissed, with the Army's popular Chief of Staff, Jack Twat, taking over.
A 40-foot sperm whale, which was stranded in the Firth of Forth for more than 4 days, is now thought to be swimming towards open waters again. It freed itself late last night. Marine experts are hoping to establish this morning whether the whale is finally back at sea.
Good luck to the whale. 8:10 is the time. An investigation is
Now,
underway
if you
at the
work
Maze.
with voices, there's a lot to love about this clip. I really love the way the guy coming down the line has got to say a bit of a daft name. I don't know how familiar you are with British English, but twat is quite rude, okay? And he just goes for it. Nothing to see here, popular Chief of Staff, Jack Twat. And if you listen very, very carefully, back in the studio, someone leans into Charlotte Green, who was about to read the news headlines, and they do one thing. What they do is they whisper, Jack Twat, right at her. And they're doing that for one reason, and one reason only. They are trying to make her laugh. And at first, she's okay. And you can see the pitch of her voice is pretty well controlled. And then the laughter starts to get her. And the first thing you see is she loses that fine control that you're using, or that beautiful control of your ribcage to do when you're speaking. That's the first victim of laughter. Because you start to lose that fine control, and you start to lose control of the pitch of your voice. You're seeing the pitch of her voice start to go all over the place, and then it suddenly shoots up. And then by the end, she has continued to make squeaking noises after she's stopped talking, because now she's fully laughing. Now, this is someone who's paid to talk on the radio for a living. She doesn't want to laugh. She'll get in trouble for laughing. The BBC does not like its newsreaders or its sports presenters showing emotion when they're speaking. They call it breaking, and it's a bad thing. So this is the power of laughter, in addition to actually seeing how it's duking it out in her motor system between speech and laughter. So you can see the mechanisms of laughter here. Go back to this idea that Darwin had, though. Is laughter really something that we find across all human cultures? Because what we find is, when you test it, people can recognize it when we sort of put it in there with this mix of other sounds like laugh, disgust and fear and anger. But that's all being tested within one culture. Of course, humans are diverse and found all around the globe, and there are very big influences of culture on how we perceive the world, how we understand the world, and this can have a big impact on our ability to perceive emotions. So what we need to do is to actually find out, is laughter truly recognized all around the world? And to do this, what you need to do is find a community of people who are not contaminated by our culture, and see if they recognize laughter and other vocal emotions recorded back in the UK, and we record them expressing emotion, and see if people back in the UK can recognize this. So this meant my PhD student, Disa Sota, did several trips out to Namibia, where she was working with the Himba. The Himba live in northern Namibia. You can visit Namibia and go to sort of tourist settlements to meet members of the Himba. These are not the people she was working with. She was driving for days with an interpreter to work with people who had not met someone from outside of the Himba community before. They live in effectively a Stone Age lifestyle. They're an amazing people. A couple of the men, a couple of times a year, will interact with Angolan cattle dealers, and that's about it for sort of interactions with other cultures. So if they recognize our emotional expressions and vice versa, it's good evidence that what we've got really is something that is more culturally non-specific. We, of course, need the Himba to produce examples of emotions for us, so have a look at this. See if you can tell what emotion this is, and if there's somebody from the Himba in the audience, and this has happened to me, shtum, okay? Absolutely no points for spotting that he started laughing at the end there. Anybody take a guess what emotion he's expressing before then? Yeah? It's very, very exciting. There's a lot of energy there, isn't there? Do you think it's positive or negative? So it's positive, it's excited. Any other guesses? He's actually expressing achievement, triumph. So in the UK, it wouldn't be at all unusual for people to produce a kind of woohoo sound for that, although I think we got that from Homer Simpson. I think if I had a time machine and I went back to the 1980s, I don't know if you'd get that. There might be a lot more yay or something. Now, what's interesting is he knows what it means when you ask him to celebrate something. It's not an emotion that is so culture-specific, it's meaningless to another culture. And there are emotions that are like this. There's a Japanese emotion describing a sense of belonging to a large organization, which I can kind of see what that means, but I don't have any familiarity with that emotional state. That's not this. So here we've got an emotion that he understands, and he knows an expression that goes with it, but when he produces it, we don't hear it as sounding celebratory, triumphant, like he's achieved something. And likewise, if you play him someone from Europe going, yes, or something like that, he doesn't hear triumph. So what you've got here is not a basic emotional expression. This is a culture-specific emotion. And then at the end, and if you listen carefully, he's being laughed at continuously by his friends. He cracks and starts laughing, and then suddenly we have a completely recognizable emotion. And that's what we find when we look at the data. So if we go back to Paul Ekman's emotions, that of course he was studying from the face and all our works with voices, we find that anger, disgust, fear, sadness, and surprise, they're bidirectionally recognized. So the English recognize the Himba recognize the English. What this means in practice is if you were in the middle of the Namibian desert and you get vomit on your hand and you go, ugh, people know exactly what that means. The only positive emotion, which is passing the threshold, there's something funny happening with relief, and I'm happy to take questions on that. But the triumph sounds, the pleasure sounds, they are not being bidirectionally recognized. The only one that is, quite comfortably, is laughter. So it really does look like certainly in terms of being recognized across different human communities, it truly does look like a basic emotion. And of course, we should have expected it to be a basic emotion, because we are not the only animals that laugh. So we're very familiar with the first appearance of laughter in babies. Is normally seen for humans around sort of 2.5, 3 months old. And it's strongly associated with tickling. Tickling is something you cannot do on your own. You have to be tickled by someone else. So the first appearance is a social behavior. It's normally a parent or someone that the baby feels safe with, and the tickling leads to laughter. So laughter doesn't emerge outside of social interactions. It's absolutely happening in social interactions. And amazingly, that's true for other animals as well. So chimpanzees first start laughing when they are tickled and they're babies. I particularly like the look on the older chimpanzee's face here, like, ugh, you're going to get tickled. Yes, oh, got you. That's even true for rats. In fact, So you first see laughter appearing in infancy when babies are tickled by parents or some other adult that the baby feels safe with. There's one thing that works on human babies to make them laugh that does not work as far as we can see on any other animal. Can you guess what that is? It's peekaboo. Now, we can come back to this in questions, but I think that is interesting because tickling is very physical. Peekaboo is not. Peekaboo is like an abstract connection. I'm looking at you. And humans, of course, care a great deal about eye gaze. The other thing that's interesting, though, about peekaboo is it only works if that person's really there. Just eyes opening and closing on a TV screen doesn't work for a baby. So you still need that connection. You need two people. You probably wonder what laughter would look like in a non-human animal. I've got a short video here of the late comedian Robin Williams meeting Coco, who was a gorilla who lived in the US, and she signed. And what she does at the start of this interaction is she signs really humorlessly, tickle me, like tickle me, hashtag relatable content. And he tickles her. It's hard. It's really hard to tickle gorillas. And they've got really thick skin. You've got to really get in there. And you'll see what happens when he manages it. The other thing to notice with Coco is she was phenomenally interested in human nipples, and I say this to explain why she continuously is touching Robin Williams slightly inappropriately. Okay, so here we go. Starts with tickle, tickle.
Tickle.
And she's having a quick check. What have you got going on there? And it's hard. He's trying, and it's not working yet. And then he starts to actually manage to tickle her, start to look at how she's moving and what her face is doing. Now this becomes very recognisably laughter. And then she's just had enough of that. Let's not waste each other's time here. So what we can see is that laughter actually is not something that you only find in humans, and it's something that has its origins in infancy, whether you're a human or a rat or another ape. And its first appearance has more to do with a social behaviour than anything to do with something more complex like humour or amusement. So the role of laughter in infancy seems to be kind of a bonding behaviour with parents. And then as we get older, you find laughter becoming more and more important. So Panksepp, who did the really beautiful work with rats, he said at its heart, the thing that you find in common across different instances of laughter in different animals is it functions like an invitation to play. We're not going to hurt each other. We're not going to bite each other. I'm not going to try and eat you or anything like that. That the end of game here is simply enjoyment. And of course, play is extremely important to mammals. All mammals play when they are juveniles, and some mammals continue to play throughout their entire lives, like dogs, otters, humans. It's a very important behaviour. And of course, mammals have large brains, and we have an extended period of being juveniles when we're training up these big brains. And play forms a very important part of that development. Play is, at one hand, sort of pointless and fun, but it's also a context for learning about your social world, for learning about the things that you will do when you are an adult. So kittens play differently from horses, and horses play differently from children. It's a very, very important behaviour, and it's a species-specific behaviour, and it can be very ambiguous and difficult to know exactly, if you're not part of that group or you're not one of those animals, necessarily to know what play is, when is play happening. So animals will actually mark play, they will show play to make their intentions clear. One of the ways they do this is what's called play face. So you get these very loose, gentle mouths. There's no tension in those mouths. Play is so important to dogs. They have another signal. When dogs do that, it's called the play bow, and it means everything after this is a game. I might growl at you, but I'm not cross, because this is a game. We're playing a game. So it's like a marker of my intent. It's very, very difficult to get photographs of adults, humans with play face. They tend to tighten into a social smile. So if you take away nothing else from my talk, I need you to notice how very much my brother looks like that chimpanzee. Okay, you got that? When there is a noise associated with play face, it's laughter. And it's, as I said, this is Panksepp's idea. It's this invitation to play. And of course, this is really important. The same behaviour presented with and without laughter could simply be violent. The laughter makes it your intentions quite clear. You have no intention to harm. So it's actually a very, very important behaviour in play. And it carries on being important into our adult lives. And Robert Provine, a US psychologist, has done a huge amount of work on this. And what he finds is that a lot of our intuitions about laughter, and this was true of me when I started working with laughter, they're often wrong. So if you ask people what makes you laugh, they will talk about comedy and jokes and humour, and we do laugh at comedy, jokes and humour. But most of our laughter is purely social. We laugh when we're with other people. It's primed by other people being around us. You're 30 times more likely to laugh if there is somebody else with you than if you're on your own. And you'll laugh more if you know them, you'll laugh more if you like them. It's really strongly mediated by these social aspects. What this means in practice is that for most of us, most laughter happens in conversation, and there can be a lot of it. We haven't published this paper yet, but we've been collecting pairs of friends talking to each other. We told them it was a study on friendship. We didn't tell them it was a study on laughter. And what we find, on average, 10% of the time when friends are talking, they're laughing together. That's a huge amount of time doing a non-verbal communication. And we were surprised by this, but then in fact we actually normally are surprised by the amount of laughter going on. Everybody thinks that they laugh less than they do. There are very few studies on laughter, but there are a handful where they have compared how often people think they laugh with how often they do laugh, and you always find people always underestimate it. It's like we don't remember laughter. It's almost like laughter is a default state for certain kinds of interactions. It's all modulated by the presence of other people. So the more you know people, the more you like people, the more laughter there's going to be. And sometimes laughter can be purely behaviourally contagious. You can catch that laughter just because someone else is laughing. Now, Provine has pointed out, actually, this is true of a subset of human behaviours which are contagious. So laughter is contagious. You can find yourself laughing just because someone else was laughing. So is yawning. So scratching. Coughing can be. Blinking. Most of the blinks you do, you are blinking either for communicative reasons or because somebody else is blinking. Very rarely are you blinking because you needed to clean your eye. And the interesting thing about contagious behaviours like this is we learn to do them. Babies do not laugh contagiously. Babies never blink. They blink exactly when they need to. We learn to do this, and it's completely modulated socially, so you're much more likely to catch a laugh, a yawn, a cough, an itch, a blink off someone you know than someone you don't know. I'm sorry I haven't got it in here, but I have a photograph of my son yawning, which I used to use just to illustrate, oh, here is a yawn. And someone pointed out to me I would unfailingly start yawning as soon as I put it up. And no one in the audience yawned because they don't know who he is. So it's a very, very powerful effect. And Provine argues that it's basically just affiliative. We catch these behaviours just to show we have a link with people. And in fact, we can actually see this in brain responses to laughter. And this is the first time we looked at brain scans of laughter. Now, these are functional magnetic resonance images, and what we do with functional magnetic resonance imaging is we're basically using very large magnets to magnetize tissue, which is straightforward quantum physics, and what we're taking advantage of is two properties of how brains work. The first is that where there is local change in the activity of your brain, so where your brain starts doing more work, there is immediately more blood flow directed there. That's doing a combination of things. It's bringing along nutrients and oxygen, and it's taking away temperature. It was lowering temperature, and it's taking away waste products and carbon dioxide. So it's a complex response, but it's very tightly tied to the neural activity. And also, oxygenated and deoxygenated blood have got slightly different paramagnetic characteristics. So we can use the sorts of brain imaging we would use to get structural images of a bit of the body, we can actually tweak slightly and use to measure these changes in blood flow. And when we do this, you find these responses to emotional vocalizations. So here we've got people listening to laughter, triumph sounds, and also negative sounds like disgust, ugh, or screams of fear. And what we're finding is there's lots of activation in these regions shown in green. Now, those are called orofacial mirror regions, and those are brain areas you use when you move your face into an emotional expression or as if you're about to start making a sound. And they're recruited when you're listening to an emotional sound, but they are particularly being driven by the brain response to the laughter. They're not being driven to the disgusted ugh sounds. And what this seems to suggest is when you hear laughter, we're actually seeing your brain getting ready to join in, even though people are just having their brain scanned and we are not asking you to do anything. In fact, we didn't expect people to show this response. So we're seeing this contagion, probably because we're scanning adults, and adults have spent a lot of their life learning to laugh contagiously. So even if you're having your brain scanned, not even slightly amusing or very kind of social, when you hear this very important social cue, you're getting primed to join in. Now, contagious laughter can be extremely powerful. I've got an example here. This is another radio broadcast. This is now of two men doing a cricket commentary, and they're summing up the day's cricket. You don't need to know too much about cricket to follow this. The point is, somebody went out, and one of them makes a terrible, terrible joke, and you can see what happens to their voices. He knew exactly what was going to happen.
He tried to step over the stumps and just flicked a bail with his right
He more or less tried to do the splits over it, and unfortunately the inner part of his thigh must have
terrible joke coming up.
Just didn't quite get his leg over.
Anyhow,
Okay.
He did very well indeed, batting 131
This man's
minutes.
voice has gone up in pitch because he's smiling.
And
The man that made the joke is
Lewis
laughing.
playing extremely well for his 47 not out. Agus, do stop it.
He's asking to stop laughing.
And he was joined by De Freitas, who was in for 40 minutes, a useful little partnership there. They put on 35 in 40 minutes, and then he was caught by Dujon Walsh.
Now, at this point, the man, Brian Johnson, who's talking, takes a breath in, starts to talk again, and now the laughter has got him. And you'll start to see what it does to the pitch of his voice.
No.
You start getting these big changes in pitch, and we even get little whistling sounds.
Lawrence, always entertaining, batting for 35. 35 minutes, hit a 4 over the wicketkeepers.
Completely losing it now. The first man tries to speak.
Yes, Lawrence.
Completely fails.
Extremely well.
He hit a 4 over the wicketkeeper's head, and he was out for line. And Tarfel came in, batted for 12 minutes, and then was caught by Haynes on Patterson for 2, and there were 54 extras, and England were all out for 419. I've stopped laughing now.
So there's some interesting points to make about that. Can you see at the end there how he was getting on top of the laughter? You could actually see he was getting control back of the pitch of his voice. You actually see it happening. He says, I've stopped laughing now, I've come back down. The other thing that was interesting is that it was a terrible joke. It's an awful joke. And very, very quickly, they're not laughing because the joke is funny. They're both laughing because they're both there, and they're just setting each other off. It's why he keeps saying, oh, Agus, do stop it, because if you stop, I'll be able to stop. It's the power of contagious laughter. They're just batting it back and forth. Obviously, the BBC are very cross with them about this. Brian Johnson went straight from the studio and wrote a letter of apology, and he still got told off by the BBC because he'd shown emotion. Nowadays, like 30 years later, Brian Johnson died some time ago, and the BBC will play this clip at the drop of a hat, because I think actually with the distance of them now no longer being cross that they were laughing and making, showing emotion, there's also something else going on here, because we don't catch laughter contagiously from people we don't know. You're much more likely to catch it from someone you know or someone you like or someone you love. You can kind of hear here that if those two men had absolutely detested each other, they would not have been laughing like that. You're hearing something that sounds a bit more like friendship. So laughter is complex in humans. So we can laugh because other people are laughing. We can just catch it. We can laugh to make and maintain social bonds. It's an incredibly efficient way of smoothing over very brief interactions with people or shoring up more long-lasting relationships or initiating them. We laugh in conversations to show we agree, we understand, we recognize, we remember something. What Robert Provine has shown that at any one point in a conversation, the person who laughs most is the person who's talking. So we're actually using the laughter communicatively to try and get other people to agree with us, to show they agree, to show they understand, to show they remember. So it's a very, very communicative behavior. We will laugh to reframe things as play. And I'm going to come back to this, but it's actually a very effective, very important use of laughter. Remember Jan Pankskep's idea that it's an invitation to play. And what you can do is reframe things that might seem serious or difficult to say, no, this is fine. This behavior is okay. I am all right. We are playing. This is not harmful. This is not dangerous. Then if you look at laughter in conversation, so this is just an example of two people who've come into our lab for our study on friendship. Let's skip forward a bit. So they're just being set up in the experiment here. Just look how frequently they're smiling, and as soon as the woman leaves the room, they actually just start laughing. So nothing's really happening, but they're laughing because they're both there, they're both friends. This is what we do. Nothing funny is happening. This is a very boring psychology experiment, and there's actually just continuous flow of laughter. Now, if you think about the speed with which we use laughter in conversation, what you're actually seeing is something. Remember, the person who laughs most is the person who's talking. Something that's got much more communicative aspects to it than some of that really helpless laughter I've played you. Sorry, they're laughing too much. I have to stop them. Careful what you wish for, Sophie. So if you think about those people who were laughing on the radio and they could not stop laughing, that seems like a qualitatively different kind of laughter to this communicative laughter. They laugh as soon as Marie, my PhD student, leaves the room to sort of say, this is silly, isn't it? We're both here. All this kind of reframe it as play. We know each other. All the positive stuff about laughter, but it appears really quickly and then it goes away again. It just keeps doing this. That's very different from that laughter that's coming in and stomping around when those people are trying to do the radio broadcast, where the laughter is just like, no, I'm going to be here for a while. You are going to be laughing solidly and without pause for about 2 minutes. That's quite a different kind of laughter. And we got interested in whether or not that actually meant something different in terms of the brain. And there is a literature on this for faces. So this is Paul Ekman smiling. Which of these two photographs of Paul Ekman looks nicer? One on the left or the one on the right? The one on the right? That's because, and it's very hard to see because of how we process faces, the picture on the left is actually a composite picture. The smiles are the same. The eyes here have come from what's called a neutral face. And when psychologists talk about neutral faces, they mean muscularly neutral. A bit more like a bitchy resting face, I think. But it means it's not emotionally neutral, but there's no movement around the eyes. So this gives you a smile that looks colder. So we cover up the eyes, you can see that. The mouths are the same, and the eyes are different. And the argument is, when we smile spontaneously, it looks more like this, because the eyes get engaged more. When we deliberately smile, or we try to produce a smile to demand, it looks more like this because the muscles around the eyes are somewhat less well engaged. So there is some evidence showing this. If you provoke a smile, if you get a smile out of somebody, if they smile in an involuntary way, it tends to look more like that one, whereas people smiling to command often looks more like that. Of course, nothing new under the sun. Of course, Charles Darwin described this also. And we set out to do this with laughter. And to do this, we did whatever it took to get people to laugh. So we had spontaneous, involuntary laughter. And we also asked people to laugh to command. So have a listen to this laugh and tell me if you think this is somebody laughing to command or laughing helplessly. Does that sound like helpless laughter, spontaneous laughter, or laughter to command? Spontaneous, that's me. So that is me laughing spontaneously. And in fact, it's very, very high-pitched. I couldn't sing that high-pitched. What often happens when people are laughing spontaneously, as you saw earlier, is you get these really high-pitched sounds produced because people start squeezing air out under much higher forces than you could ever use for speaking. How about this laugh? Yeah. Sorry. Does that sound more posed? Yeah, so that's like someone laughing to command. And they are quite different. And people are good at spotting the difference. So what we tend to find are those spontaneous laughs, which makes sense. They're longer, they're higher in pitch, they're being produced with a lot more energy. The more volitional, those communicative pose laughs, they are often more nasal. And actually, you couldn't do that if you were laughing helplessly. It looks like people are deliberately marking the non-spontaneous laugh, like I'm giving you this. And of course, remember, most of the laughter you encounter out there in the real world isn't people helpless on the floor with laughter. It is this more conversational laughter. And it can be modulated, people perceive it differently, you can bring in faces and do different things, but there's some interesting work from Greg Bryant in San Francisco showing that actually, looking at these conversational laughs, you can track how well people know each other, because the more you like the person you're with, the more warm these conversational smiles sound. These conversational laughs sound. So it's actually a very nuanced behavior, this conversational laughter. It's something, again, we learn to understand. This is a very big study that we ran at the Science Museum, looking just at age and asking people to tell if laughs were, we call them real or posed, but it's the same, it's spontaneous or conversational. And what you see is small children don't know what you mean. They hear laughter, and they don't think there's different kinds of laughter. And as you get older, you improve very quickly on the real laughs. But actually, the improvement on the social, those conversational, those pose laughs, is slow. And in fact, while you peak in understanding the real laughs, by the time you hit the end of adolescence, you continue learning to understand about the social laughs throughout your entire early adult life. People don't peak in performance till they hit their late 30s. The brain is very interested in the difference between these different kinds of laughs. We just played these laughs to people and we disguised them with other sounds going on, so they didn't realize it was a study on laughter. Doesn't matter. The brain is sensitive to the difference. You get more auditory areas activated, shown in blue, when you are listening to spontaneous laughs, possibly because you hear quite an unambiguous sound that contains sounds you don't normally hear. And if anything, you get more activation to the communicative laughter and a more distributed network associated with what's called mentalizing. So if you think about what somebody else knows, or if you try and work out what somebody else is feeling, those are called mentalizing tasks, and they're recruited when you hear someone laughing who's clearly not laughing helplessly. So when you hear someone going, ah, ha, 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 you hear someone producing this, well, it's sort of an intentional laugh, it's a communicative laugh, but they're not helpless with laughter. There's a reason why they produce that sound. Maybe they're trying to get someone to like them. Maybe they're trying to cover up being angry. Maybe they're trying to cover up being in pain. Maybe they're trying to cover up being sad. Maybe they're trying to cover up being embarrassed. Maybe they're trying to cover up the fact they're telling a lie and they want to work out if somebody's, to draw someone's attention away from it. We laugh like this in conversations for thousands of different reasons. And when you're an adult and you have some sense of that complexity, you're always trying to work it out. Do you remember that priming response I showed you earlier to laughter? We still see that for these laughs. But interestingly, what we find is the main difference occurs across people. So we scanned people, didn't get them to do anything to the laughter, and then we got them out the scanner, and we asked them to tell the difference. We asked them to classify those two different kinds of laughs. And there is some variation across people. What we find is the more accurate you are at distinguishing between a posed laugh and a real laugh, an involuntary laugh, the more, earlier on when we were scanning you, listening to any laughter, you activated those orofacial mirror regions, that priming response. What this means is that priming response likely isn't just contagion. When you get ready to join in when you hear laughter, you actually understand what that laughter means better. And this opens up the possibility of individual differences. We've already seen that it's something we learn to understand. We learn to find laughter contagious. We learn to understand what laughs mean. And there's a lot of variation on both of those distributions. And of course, it means that your experiences are likely to shape this. So we found, for example, teenage boys who are at risk of psychopathy show a significantly reduced pattern of activation to this sort of contagiousness, priming of laughter. Now, they are at risk of psychopathy. I'm not saying that psychopathy is a disorder of laughter, but of course, laughter is a social emotion. Laughter is an emotion that lives in social interactions. And what you have here is a potential route for someone who might have extremely different sorts of interactions with people if they can't use laughter, as most people do, for dealing with social settings. We also ran a study recently where we just edited laughs onto the ends of jokes, and they were bad jokes. Really, well, what's brown and sticky? A stick. And we deliberately chose really bad jokes because we asked people to rate them. And what you're seeing down here in red is people's ratings of the jokes, individual jokes. They are not funny jokes. And we would deliberately chose non-funny jokes because we had them all read aloud by a comedian, and then we edited laughs onto the end of them, spontaneous laughs or posed laughs, and we got a different group of people to rate how funny the jokes were. All they're doing is rating the jokes, but as soon as you add on laughter, almost all the jokes become funnier. And the more spontaneous the laughter, the funnier it makes the jokes. We can't ignore laughter. Even in this situation, which is highly artificial, where we're playing you a joke and saying, how funny is this joke? If you've ever been to a comedy club, you'll have noticed at the end of each joke, the comedian doesn't say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how funny was that joke? You know, we're not normally asked to make that decision. But nonetheless, when you are making it, if there's laughter there, it influences you, and it influences your feelings positively for how that joke worked. So what we've got is this amazing behaviour. It's been described as the shortest distance between two people. And I've always liked this quote because it kind of gets to the intimacy of laughter. Even if it's quite a transient behaviour, it can be something that kind of speaks to some sort of meaningful closeness between two people. But it may be even more important than that. And I'm going to just finish with 2 examples of laughter. So there's some really interesting work coming out of Robert Levinson's lab in San Francisco, where he has been doing a longitudinal study of married couples in the northern San Francisco community. But every few years, he gets them into the lab, he wires them up to a polygraph so you can see how stressed they get, and he stresses them out together. He gets both members of the couple, and he puts them in a difficult situation while they're wired up to this polygraph. And he manipulates a difficult situation by asking them to have a conversation about something one of them does that irritates the other one. Okay, so just run that through your head for a second. Imagine saying to the face of your partner, here's something you do I find irritating. It's designed to be stressful, and it is stressful. What you see immediately is both members of the couple become more stressed. You see this in their physiological responses. And what he finds is the couples who'll deal with that stress with what he calls positive affect, but primarily it's laughter, not only become less stressed, they get on top of that feeling immediately, but they also are the couples that tend to stay together for longer and are happier in their relationship. So it's a positive way of managing a stressful situation that actually speaks to how strong that relationship is. But significantly, it only works if both members of the couple laugh. So if one person's going, I do snore like an absolute tinker, don't I? And the first person's going, it's a massive problem. No one feels better. There's no relief from the stress there. Now, Robert Levinson has lots of lovely videos of elderly couples making each other laugh, and I haven't got one of those. I've got a YouTube video that I've edited out a significantly large amount of swearing that's in English for some reason. But this is some young men in the former East Germany making a video to promote their heavy metal band. And what I want you to notice is what happens when things go wrong. He's expecting to be wet, he's wearing swimming trunks. He also looks cold. He's got a towel.
Schönes Wasser, warte.
There's ice.
Eis hier überall. Ja, da.
A lot of machismo.
In der Mitte am besten.
Bicep kissing along with the swearing.
Looks
apprehensive.
Yeah.
He's off.
And my new band is called Cisco.
And his friends are already laughing. And they're laughing hard. He's not laughing.
Ik wil het kijken goed.
And he looks up and he notices them and he starts to laugh now. Can you see how weak he is by the laughter? Maybe ask questions about that. He can't actually stand up. His friends are saying he can be falling over. Look, they're on the floor. So one of the nice things about working laughter is people send me quite often YouTube clips and things, and I've been sent this a few times by people saying, look, we've got a great example of Schadenfreude, it goes wrong and it is kind of funny. But actually it is a bit more complex than that, because if you notice what happens immediately, the mood initially is quite serious, a bit apprehensive, and then when they expect to happen, him going through the ice, he's got all cold, that doesn't happen. So he doesn't go through the ice, but also there isn't blood and bone everywhere. His friends start laughing. And it takes a couple of beats, and then he joins in. The invitation to play starts to work. And instead of being angry, stop filming me, or embarrassed, it becomes okay. It's funny. This is hilarious. We are sharing this moment. And if you don't believe me, imagine that clip. If he was lying there with a visibly broken leg and his friends were laughing like that, it would be unwatchable. Or if he was running around covered in blood screaming, Henrik, this is hilarious. And they were going, you've got to come back from there, Jens. You've got to go to the hospital. Again, it wouldn't be funny. What you're seeing is the laughter working, and I think that's one of the things we're enjoying. And on that point, I want to end in one last clip. So this is a very ill-tempered Boris Yeltsin, a president from a while ago. Oh, he's berating the press. Yeltsin is expected to be very rude to the press, and that's actually happening. Watch Bill Clinton. The mood is serious, and Yeltsin is unhappy.
And this is all due to you, because coming from my statement yesterday in the United Nations, and if you looked at the press reports, one could see that what you were writing was that today's meeting with President Bill Clinton was
He's just
going
laughing
to
to
be
say,
a
that's
disaster.
my name. I'm Bill Clinton.
Так вот, не первый раз я вам говорю,
Watch Yeltsin.
вы провалились.
Contagious
Well, now for the first time I can tell you that you're a disaster.
There you go. Gets a smile. You can Boris Yeltsin being, I am actually pretty funny.
Я надеюсь, что вы правильно
So
все
he's
поняли.
forcing contagious laughter on everybody, and it's working. On you go. I'll never make it. So again, you can watch that and say, oh, Bill Clinton was just hard, you know, but actually he waits for a reason to laugh. He waits for Boris Yeltsin to have said his name, and then he starts laughing, and it's just a, yes, that's my name, but it's a reason enough. And then he starts to laugh more and more, well, oh, you are the disaster. And what he's doing is he's doing absolutely reframing the whole thing as play. This is not serious, this is fine, because this guy's hilarious. And his material, as I suspected it was, is absolutely killing. And after a few beats, it really works. Yeltsin's like not only joining in contagiously, like, yeah, I'm laughing because you're laughing. He starts going, yes, I am very funny. This material is brilliant. And actually, if you look at this incredibly complex social use of laughter, in this particularly, and this is obviously an extreme situation, but that's an incredibly skilled use of laughter to turn around a very difficult situation into one which is quite positive. And the other thing that is also noticeable, he goes to great lengths to not look like he's laughing at Yeltsin. He keeps kind of including him. Like, he's not like that, this guy is an idiot, let's laugh at him. He's really making sure he's included. So there's like a hall of mirrors of complexity to how their laughter is being used here. But of course, we don't tend to think of it as being a very important aspect of leadership. And sometimes we're presented with leaders who allow us to forget that. That in fact, it's an incredibly important way that people can genuinely lead and deal with stressful situations. So Darwin was right. Darwin thought that laughter was an expression of joy. And I think really, the only thing that I would add in terms of the meaning of that joy is that its role is social. It has this intensely social meaning. You can't just march around the world laughing at everything and expect everyone to join in. Laughter is an index. It's a sign of the relationships where you find the laughter. It's something that is arising from situations rather than people or things. And it's really an important way, it's probably one of the more interesting ways that we can examine people's emotional lives in a way that takes us straight into their social interactions and the emotions that live in those interactions. And I think it's time probably for science, therefore, to start taking it a bit more seriously. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Because I've had rats as pets, and I must admit I never tried tickling them to see what does a rat sound like when it's laughing.
So the question is, what do rats sound like when they're laughing? And a very significant thing that I did mention and I did not mention is that because rats are small, their vocalizations we frequently can't hear. So Panksepp and his colleagues they're recording the sounds the rats make all the time, and they're reducing the sounds in frequency so humans can hear them. And when you do, you get this very distinct chirping sound. It's distinctly different from the other kinds of emotional vocalizations that rats make. The rats make it when they are tickled. They make it when they're playing with each other. That could still be the rat going, stop it, I don't like it, stop touching me. So empirically, if you tickle a rat and then you take your hand away, the rat will make the sound to try and get you to carry on tickling it. So it really does look like this invitation to play is really important. So it's defined functionally, it doesn't sound like human laughter. So if the question is, was Clinton's laughter engineered? I strongly suspect it is, because if you watch it, he's watching Yeltsin like a hawk, and he laughs at the first possible opportunity, and which is literally just his name. I met with Bill Clinton. He goes, yes, I'm Bill Clinton, and that's. But, and most laughter is that kind of thing. It's not, high, complex comedy, but he's looking for a reason. I think it is deliberate, because then he does, he's pulling it off well. He doesn't he's going, ha, 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 this is funny and I will laugh. He's looking warm and like he's trying to be inclusive with it. And of course, the thing is with laughter, you can fake it till you make it. You can find yourself laughing, and your social laughter will often lead to involuntary laughter. So he's letting that happen, but I strongly suspect he might not phrase it that way, but it was at some level intentional. He's looking to he's looking to turn this whole thing around, because it was just going to be an absolute furious, possibly slightly drunk man berating the press for 20 minutes otherwise. I think that's what they were all in for.
I read a book 40 years ago by Robert Ekman, and he makes a statement that humor at its heart has a victim, that it's an element of cruelty when you tell a joke. And that has stuck with me more than anything else in that book or that writer. And it might be meta, and it might be a couple of steps removed, but at some point you're laughing at somebody or some misconception or some contrary slapstick, etc. Can you comment on that? And should I feel guilty about it?
Definitely don't feel, within the general strategies of not being horrible to anybody, I think you're okay to be laughing. I think you'll notice I took a right body swerve around humour. I talk about laughter, I talk about it very functionally. And I acknowledge that we laugh at jokes and comedy, and then I do not mention it again. And I think one of the things that's very interesting is laughter is older than us. It has evolutionary precursors to us. We were laughing before we were talking. As soon as modern humans appear and they start making marks on the world and leaving a trace of their language, you find jokes. You find comedy. There is an ancient, I think the oldest joke that's been found is an ancient Egyptian, or sort of Babylonian thing in hieroglyphics, and it goes, how do you get a pharaoh to go fishing? You dress young women up in fishing nets. Now, I mean, somebody thought, in ancient Egypt that was so good. This one's for the ages. I must describe it. And there's a Roman joke book called The Laughter Lover with a load of Roman jokes in, and they are quite surprising. They lean really heavily on crucifixion as a comedic device in a way that's like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. But frequently it has this, they have the same appearance like that. They have the same look of a joke, even if the content is completely at odds with what we would joke about, and the cultural references are different. You can see the shape to it. So I think very generally what you find is there's probably always been humour, and there have been jokes. As soon as humans start having any ability to share this stuff or maybe have language, that's appeared. The only thing that you find absolutely in common across all humour over time and place is you don't find one thing that everybody finds funny over time and over place. Every year in the UK, we have the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and every year there's a joke which is announced to be the funniest joke, and every year about 2/3 of people say, I don't think that's very funny, because it's an aesthetic appreciation. There's not an objective amount of funniness. So, with that being said, it is the thing that is most common in comedy, or across all time and place, are things that contain frequently some element either of taboo stuff like wee and poo and farting, or something to do with an element of cruelty, like slapstick, or laughing at somebody, or laughing at a group of people. So a lot of the Roman jokes are about people that the Romans thought were funny, or women who the Romans thought were just dreadful. And that's, so it's a common theme. It's a very common, but what you find is it's never everything, and it never works for everybody. There's no one thing that everybody always finds funny. But one of the more common themes is that. So it's not unusual. It's a really long answer, but it's not unusual. I wouldn't say it's a complete rule, because as I say, there probably isn't a complete rule. But over time and place, it's one of the more common ones.
So laughing is definitely contagious. Humans and is social. Is also contagious and social in chimps or other animals?
That's a very good question. There is some evidence. So the question is laughter contagious in other animals? I'm going to give you two answers to that. You do find contagious behavior. Yawning has been looked at a lot more. You find contagious yawning in chimps, and you find contagious yawning in dogs. Dogs will only catch a yawn from a human they know. Chimps will only catch a yawn from a chimp they know, or any human. They might be extremely impressed by humans. There's also some work from Portsmouth in the UK where the woman called Davila Ross has looked at chimpanzee laughter, and she finds they have two kinds of laughs. They laugh differently when they're being tickled than when they're playing with each other or trying to make play last longer. Now that looks a lot like our voluntary and involuntary laughter. What she hasn't found, or she hasn't looked at yet, and I suspect it's harder to look at than yawning, is anything contagious within that. So we don't know, is the short answer. We've been trying to get a study going with someone who owns a zoo in the UK and look at contagious laughter and sort of contagious brain responses in apes and laughter, and dogs and laughter. The brain stuff's hard because it's much harder to get to their brains, and I haven't seen anything beyond that where we've actually seen the appearance of contagious laughter, but it could be that it's there, we just haven't seen it yet. It turns out, like, we were going, Davila Ross started publishing her papers on chimp laughter. All the people who'd been working with apes for the last 100 years were like, yeah, we know they laugh. Of course they laugh. They never wrote it up because, laughter. But, from Darwin's time onwards, it's been like common knowledge, just hadn't been studied scientifically or even really acknowledged. So there's a lot more to know.